It's about 10:45 a.m. on Saturday, November 8th, I think. Um, Took pups to the beach this morning. Had a great time. Uh, Went and got myself a big, beautiful breakfast afterwards. While I was having breakfast, I listened to something that was just absolutely fascinating. Everybody who follows me knows that I subscribe to the Bulwark, their website, and all their stuff. And every Saturday, the woman who founded the Bulwark, the publisher, Sarah Longwell, puts out a podcast called the Focus Group. And like two, three, four times a week throughout the course of the year, she does focus groups with different segments of voters. And this week's episode was Gen Z, was primarily young progressive women. It was fascinating. I listen to the focus group every week. Oftentimes it's completely infuriating because you're listening to actual Trump voters and the stupid shit that they say. This week's episode was not that. It focused on the gender gap among young men and women when it comes to politics. They talked a lot about algorithms and, Gen Z kids that graduated right before COVID hit or graduated after COVID hit, the impact of that on their lives. It was just such a fascinating episode, and how algorithmically young men and young women live in completely different universes. And they talked about young men kind of getting red-pilled and, consuming content from podcasters or creators, other young men who like actively hate women, like Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes, and the impact that that has on young men and young women's perceptions of young men. And a lot of these young women, they talked about the importance of having a family. None of them mentioned having a husband. They're just not looking at young men as being worthy of being partners with in relationships, or as being husbands or fathers to their children. They don't view most of these young men in that way because they're all getting red-pilled and listening to Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes. And, it was very interesting to listen to this episode this week because it pops up in the context of election night last Tuesday. And, in Manhattan or in New York City, women voted for Mamdani by almost 80%. In New Jersey, women voted for Mikey Sherrill by almost 80%. In Virginia, women voted for Abigail Spanberger by almost 80%. And the right-wing MAGA manosphere podcast pastor evangelical crowd is responding pretty uniformly to this by saying, we need to take away women's right to vote. We need to repeal the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that gave white women the right to vote. And it was super fascinating. And I mean, I took a bunch of notes while I was listening to it. And like one of the groups of young women, it's like they brought up the male loneliness epidemic and just said these guys are embarrassing. Young red-pilled men are just embarrassing as people, and they don't want anything to do with them. And one woman spoke very eloquently, about, she's like, I don't need a partner in that way. My heart is full from the friendships and relationships that I have with the other women in my life. And they talked a lot about the differences of friendship between young men and young women, and how challenging it is for young people to socialize, and we're losing third spaces. Like, you've got home, you've got work, and you need third spaces where people can go and socialize with each other in like a normal kind of way. They also talked a lot about how, being on lockdown during COVID, and it's like I remember when lockdown happened, in the middle of March of 2020, and just thinking, man, this is really going to suck for kids that are like a senior or a junior in high school. They're going to lose so much. And, they also talked about kind of a resurgence in religion and spirituality and church spaces and community. And that's gaining new emphasis, I guess, or importance for young women. But they also talked about, people this age and like their levels of anxiety being basically off the charts. And, but in slightly broader terms, it's like post-COVID, post-lockdown, people are lonely, and there's a sadness, and there's still grieving for things that they lost during COVID, whether it's you were a high school senior, or whether you were Gen Z age and one of your parents died of COVID and died alone in the hospital because you weren't permitted to go see them or other family members. And they talked at great length about how COVID in so many ways just shaped the worldview of so many young people and, altered their lives in a way that they perceive as being permanent. And then a discussion about like young people and their relationships to screens and screen time, and AI and like Chat GPT, and how young people are using this and trying to get up to speed with it because they have tremendous anxiety about the job market. We've had over 1 million layoffs this year. Young people aren't able to find jobs. They aren't able to get generally incomes that will allow them to buy a home or, be able financially to raise a family. And, but people in this generation using AI as a substitute for friendships, or using AI or Chat GPT or something like that as a therapist. And then at the end, they went through, I guess there was an NBC poll recently that basically showed that young progressive women getting married, having kids, being a wife, being a mother, way low on their priority list, way low. And a lot of people were alarmed by that. And you hear some of these young women speak, and they're like, yeah, I'd love to have kids, but I don't need to have a husband in order to do that. They are getting their own financial security in place, their own educations in place. They're buying their own homes in many cases. And, but then they closed out the episode with a focus group of some young Gen Z Trump voters, women and men, and asked them to rank or prioritize things. Faith, marriage, kids, for all of them. Faith, marriage, kids, boom, 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 for every single one of them. And it was a really interesting juxtaposition, to hear these young progressive women talk about their lives and how their lives are. And then it's like you flip over to this Gen Z group of Trump voters, and it was just trad wife, man. Trad wife, trad wife, trad wife. Faith, marriage, kids. Faith, marriage, kids. But anyway, that episode came out today, November 8th. The guest was a woman named Rachel Janfaza, Janfaza, who I guess is like kind of a Gen Z researcher, and is Gen Z herself. It was an absolutely fascinating episode. You have to subscribe to the Bulwark to get it. I think the Focus Group podcast might be behind the paywall, but you should subscribe to the Bulwark anyway because it's a great website. They put out more quality content each week than you could possibly consume. And it's all good stuff. But yeah, you should go subscribe to the Bulwark and, tell them Hawk sent you. Have a great Saturday, everybody. Be safe.